Today I want to continue our discussion of evolutionary theory. First, just taking a moment to quickly review where we are and then to continue where we are in our discussion. So we last completed talking about some of the forces that are behind evolution, that are responsible for genetic change in a population over time. So one of these, of course, is inheritance. Life begets life. Genes are inherited. And again, this is evidence of a common ancestry. So just as you share genes with other humans, and you do share genes with other humans, that's evidence of a common ancestry with other humans. The fact that you share genes with a chimpanzee, about 98.5% of your genes is, and you do share those genes with a chimpanzee, is evidence that you have a common ancestor with chimpanzees. The fact that you share genes with a mouse, and you do share genes with the mouse, is evidence of a common ancestry with the mouse. You share genes with a banana, which is evidence of a common ancestry with a banana, and so on and so on and so on. So again, this is a real effect and something that we can observe and test and measure. Secondly, random genetic change. Again, mutations, point mutations, chromosomal mutations, and so on. We can measure those. Those are heritable. That's a real effect, observable effect. That's what creates new traits in populations, new genes in populations. Natural selection, the fact that nature selects for traits. Again, this is a real observable effect, a testable effect, and we've done that many, many times and discussed that already. So again, these are some of the forces behind genetic change in a population over time. And so the next one I want to discuss is something known as genetic drift. And as we've discussed, some of these processes are random, some are not. And what really defines genetic drift is that it is random. Genetic drift is a random process, and it has to be a random process to be considered genetic drift. And so what genetic drift is trying to tell us really is just really what the phenomenon is, where you have certain allelic frequencies or gene frequencies, and through natural random processes, they drift from one condition to another condition. And so let's go ahead and look at some situations here. So again, it is a random process, and that's really what defines genetic drift. So typically genetic drift affects small populations. So let's say we have a very small population of two individuals that are heterozygous, and we've kind of looked at examples like this before. So here 50% of the alleles would be dominant, 50% of the alleles would be recessive. Now, if these individuals mate, is it possible that they could have an offspring that's homozygous recessive? Absolutely, that's possible. Now, if they had a homozygous recessive offspring, would that be due to the fact that there was some genetic cause for that, or did nature select for that? No, that's just the way it happens sometimes. That's a random process. Is it possible they could have a second offspring that's homozygous recessive? Absolutely. There's not a very good chance of that. There's only a 1 out of 4 chance that they would have a homozygous recessive offspring. And again, if we had the chance of having 2 homozygous recessive offsprings, if you're heterozygotes, would be 1/4 times 1/4, so 1/16. But could it happen? Absolutely. Could they have a third child that's homozygous recessive? Absolutely. So again, or offspring if we're not talking about humans. So the point is that just in a single generation, just through random processes, just because of the nature of inheritance and so on, it is possible for frequencies to drift from a 50-50 percentage to a new percentage. And let's say now that the parents die of old age, now you would have a population that's 100% homozygous recessive. They would only be passing around recessive alleles in the population. So again, in a short period of time, you could have a fairly significant change in allelic frequencies, not because nature is selecting for these, but that's just the way it happened. Now, other effects are a couple of effects that we generally are described in the discussion of genetic drift, but which are not necessarily genetic drift. One of these is what's known as the founder effect. And so founder effect occurs when a new population is established. So let's say that we have some kind of a mainland population, and let's say that there's an island off of that, but that we have a geographically separated landmass of some type. And so again, we have a population with genetic diversity, so there are a number of allelic frequencies here, diversity in the population. And let's say then that some of the individuals from this population colonize this island or landmass from the original population. And let's say that the individuals that get to that landmass do not necessarily reflect the diversity we see in the original population. Now, they could also then establish a new population of their own then that would not necessarily reflect the genetic diversity that we see in the original population. Now, that could be an example of genetic drift if the founding population gets to this new habitat through chance. So that would be genetic drift if it was just purely circumstantial. And we have seen examples of this in recent years. For example, as you probably aware, as the Earth is warming, we've had a number of very serious hurricanes. And so one of the things that have been observed in recent years is that following hurricanes, you have tremendous rain, wind, and so on. And so you'll end up with these huge mats of vegetation, trees and branches and foliage and so on that wash out of rivers. And a lot of times animals will be found in those rafts or those mats of vegetation. And so again, one of the things that's been observed, for example, are iguanas that will be sitting on these rafts of vegetation. They get washed out of river systems. So again, if you're just an iguana sitting in a tree, and the next thing you know, you're an iguana sitting on a raft of vegetation, and then you wash up on the shore of some other island, you didn't get there because of some genetic advantage. It's just that you happened to be in the wrong tree at the wrong time, and you got washed out to sea and eventually washed up on an island, which I guess would be good luck for you in that situation. So if it's just circumstantial or luck, that's genetic drift. But if this new population was established because there was some genetic advantage, let's say iguanas had to swim, and the best swimmers get to the island, they have a genetic advantage. That's not genetic drift. That would be natural selection. So sometimes it's hard for us to know whether genetic drift is behind what we see in these situations or whether it's natural selection. But again, it would be considered genetic drift only if it was circumstantial or luck or randomness that gets this new population established. Now, another situation is a bottleneck that sometimes is described as genetic drift. And a bottleneck takes its description from the idea that if you have a large population and for some reason there's a constriction like the neck of a bottle, and a few individuals from that population survive that do not reflect the genetic diversity of the original population, we refer to that as a genetic bottleneck. So again, the new population does not show the genetic diversity of the original population. Now again, that could be genetic drift if the surviving individual survived due to luck of some type. But if they've survived due to some genetic advantage, that really is not genetic drift. That would be an example of natural selection. So again, the concept here is that, again, you start with a population with tremendous genetic diversity, and for whatever circumstances, individuals die, and the remaining population does not reflect the genetic diversity of the original population. So again, that would be genetic drift if they survive due to luck. So again, if you're a bird sitting on one side of a mountain like Mount St. Helens, you're a bird sitting on the other side, Mount St. Helens blows up, on one side the animals get killed, on the other side some animals survive. Again, that's not necessarily a genetic advantage, it's just you happen to be on the right side of the mountain at the right time. That would be genetic drift. But let's say it's the disease that wipes out a population, you end up with a few survivors because they have a better immune system. That's a bottleneck as well, but that's a bottleneck due to natural selection, nature selecting for the best immune systems. And again, a population here could reestablish itself, and it wouldn't necessarily reflect the genetic diversity of the original population. So one population that we think suffered a bottleneck in the past, for example, is the cheetah population. Cheetah population, some people estimate that maybe got down to as few as a dozen individuals. I've also read that some people think it actually may have just been a surviving brother-sister pair. But among mammals, it is one of the most genetically similar mammals that we know. So we do know that there was a genetic bottleneck in the past. We just don't know the nature of the bottleneck, whether it was due to natural selection or genetic drift. Okay. Now another example is the prairie chicken in Illinois. The greater prairie chicken at one time back in the 1800s had a very large population, a very large distribution, and the modern distribution is highly constricted, as you can see here. So that is an example of a bottleneck. And again, when we look at the genetic makeup of that bottleneck population, if we look historically, and this is the column that's going to be of most interest to us, looking at the number of alleles per locus on a chromosome. In the historic population, again, there are about 5.2 alleles per locus, and that is comparable to other populations, diverse populations, large populations that we find in other states, such as Kansas, Nebraska, and Minnesota. You can see that these are all in the fives somewhere. But in our bottleneck population, again, there's much less genetic diversity, only about 3.7 alleles per locus on a chromosome. So again, this is evidence of a genetic bottleneck. So again, bottom line then, when we see these effects like founder effect and bottleneck, if it's due to some genetic advantage, then that's natural selection. If it's due to circumstance, that would be genetic drift. Okay, now one other factor which can modify and quickly, actually relatively quickly change the genetic makeup of populations is migration. So again, if you have a population or two populations here that are geographically separated but freely interbreed or have the potential to interbreed, and for some reason you have members of one population that migrate to this new area, perhaps due to drought, perhaps there's been some calamity in the ecosystem, and they move to this new area, that you can see would change the genetic makeup of the population very, very quickly. So again, migration is not probably that common, but it is something that can change the genetic makeup of a population pretty rapidly. So this isn't something that would take thousands of years. It could occur in a short period of time. Now, really where we're headed here, again, is as we talk about evolution, really, we're also looking at the diversity of life, the tremendous number of species that we see in nature. So I want to talk about speciation and speciation events as well. So to do that, we need to define what a biological species is. So generally speaking, we define a biological species as being a group of organisms that will interbreed under natural conditions. So the arrow here is representing that members of a biological species interbreed freely with one another. And again, that would be under natural conditions is normally how we define that. And when we say interbreed, it means that they will produce what we call viable offspring, which is another way of saying that they're fertile offspring. So that would be our definition of a biological species. Now, speciation then, the generation of new species, then requires genetic isolation. So again, that's how we're defining what species are. When they stop breeding with one another, that's a speciation event, and they are no longer the same thing. So when their genes are telling them they're no longer the same organism, or they themselves, through their behavior, are telling one another they're no longer the same organism, we say they're no longer the same organism. So again, let's say we have two populations, and if they can freely interbreed, that would be considered the same species. If they cannot interbreed or do not interbreed on their own through physiological or behavioral mechanisms, then we would say that they are different species. So speciation then requires what we call isolating mechanisms. These isolating mechanisms are what isolate populations genetically. And we put these into two general categories. One of these would be premating or prezygotic mechanisms, and the other would be postmating or postzygotic. So the idea behind premating or prezygotic mechanisms, as it suggests, is that these would be mechanisms that prevent mating, and again, primarily behavioral. So for example, I'm going to assume, in fact, I'm going to hope, that when you go to the zoo, and let's say imagine you go to the zoo, and you go to the gorilla exhibit. Again, I'm assuming here and I'm hoping that when you get to the gorilla cages or the gorilla exhibit, you don't look at the gorillas and go, wow, she's really cute. I'd like to marry her. So I'm assuming that that's the case. And conversely, the gorilla is not looking at you and saying, wow, you're really cute. Wink, wink. So my hope is, again, that that's not what's going to happen, and I'm certain that it doesn't happen. So that's an example of a premating isolating mechanism. There's no attraction. You don't want to copulate with that animal, and as a result, you don't copulate. And so that's a premating isolating mechanism. And these can be very, very subtle. For example, you and I might look at two birds and say, wow, you look like the same thing. You guys should mate with one another. But they will look at each other and say, no, we're not the same thing. We don't want to mate with one another. So example, in birds, sometimes it can just be a minor thing, like a difference in a call. Among other animals, it might be just a change in scent that would normally trigger mating behavior, won't trigger that mating behavior. So anyway, so again, this would be a premating isolating mechanism if copulation isn't going to occur. Or it could also be an anatomical situation where they may want to mate, but anatomically they cannot mate. Now, postmating or postzygotic isolating mechanisms would be those that occur after copulation. And again, an example of this would be that animals are looking at each other and saying, hey, we're the same thing. We actually copulate, but we can't produce viable offspring. So for example, a mare horse and a jack donkey will look at each other and say, yeah, we're the same thing, and they'll actually copulate. And they can't produce a living offspring, which is the mule, but the mule is a sterile offspring. So here's a situation where the animals think they're the same thing through their behavior, but the genes are telling them, you know what, you're just not the same thing anymore. You're close, You've recently diverged from one another. You've recently evolved enough differences to be two different things. And so again, it is a living offspring, but it's not a fertile offspring. So mules are sterile, and so we do not consider that evidence, or we consider that evidence of a speciation event, and we consider horses and donkeys to be different species of animals. So these barriers then can sometimes be broken down. So again, we can see the close evolutionary relationships between organisms sometimes. For example, a blue and gold macaw and a scarlet macaw in the wild, will not mate with one another. So again, they have slightly different, they're different colorations and so on. There's different behaviors and so on. And so they're not attracted to one another normally in the wild, even if they were to have overlapping ranges, and they won't breed in the wild. But in captive populations, especially if you take young birds, if you take a very young blue and gold macaw and raise it with a scarlet macaw, they will essentially imprint on one another, and they can produce viable offspring, and this is known as a Catalina macaw. So they produce a Catalina macaw. Catalina macaws can breed with one another. They can breed back to either parent here. So again, we would consider blue and gold macaws and scarlet macaws different species because in the natural setting, they don't normally mate, but we can override those natural conditions. So again, they're telling us that they have a very recent common ancestor, and this is a recent speciation event. So genetically, they're very similar, except for the behavioral mechanisms that keep them apart. Again, another example of where this is a transient situation involves a type of salamander that we find around the Central Valley of California, the genus Insatina. And Insatina, again, there are a number of what we describe as subspecies that exist around, or varieties that exist around the Central Valley of California. So again, imagine that this Central Valley of California, we have the coast on this side, coastal ranges on this side, Sierra Nevadas, Pacific Ocean out here, of course. And so in the southern part of the range, there's a variety known as S. schultzi, and it will interbreed at the margins of Xanthotheca, where they're boundaries intersect, they will interbreed freely with one another and produce hybrids. Going north, there's another variety, Oregonensis, that will, where it overlaps with the Xanthotheca, will interbreed with Xanthotheca. Oregonensis continues up the northern range all the way up into Oregon, but in the northern part of the Central Valley, it overlaps with Platensis, and they freely interbreed. Platensis then also is found on the eastern side in the Sierra Nevadas. And in the southern portion of the Sierra Nevadas, it intersects with a variety known as crockeater, and they interbreed. There's a slight break in the range of crockeater. Again, in the past, this range was connected, but there's a current separation in that range. So crockeater is found just to the south as well. And then crockeater intersects with cloudberry, interbreeds with cloudberry. But in San Diego County, right here in this area near Palomar Mountain, cloudberry and S. schultzi, their ranges overlap, and they do not interbreed with one another. So again, what we have an example here is essentially a gradualism, if you will, as the range has distributed north and then south around the coastal range and Sierra Nevada range. There's been enough genetic difference that when we get to the extreme differences, they are no longer the same thing. So this creates kind of a logistic problem for us. What do we consider this? Is all one species? These two certainly are not one species. Do we consider these separate species even though they were naturally, breed with one another? So again, there's a little bit of just a logistic problem, but it's very interesting in that we're looking at this evolutionary event that's occurred around the Central Valley, and we finally get enough genetic difference that they're no longer the same organism. So at the extremes, they're not the same organism, but in the intermediates, they see themselves as the same thing. So again, a speciation event in progress there. So as we look at speciation events then, we look at these as being of three major types. One type being allopatric speciation. And what this word means, allo means different or other, patric is a reference to country, as in patriotism. So in allopatric speciation, what we have is the physical separation of populations, and then that leads to speciation. So again, let's say we have a large population, and for some reason this population is split or separated. So this might be due to separation of continental masses, for example, perhaps a mountain range or an extreme valley, like the Grand Canyon has separated these populations in one way or another. So the point is that they get physically separated, they can no longer interbreed with one another, and evolution takes its course. mutation, natural selection, other forces act on the two populations. And of course, many of those forces are random processes, so there's no guarantees, especially if they're in different habitats. For example, if this is a mountain range, we would have very different climatic, geologic, and geographic effects on the two populations. So they potentially evolve in different ways to the point where even if they see each other again, they now no longer see themselves as the same organism. So again, we see a lot of examples of this. Again, we see mainland populations, island populations. We can compare organisms on one continent and another. And we see, again, example after example after example, where we see obvious genetic ancestry, but enough genetic differences to create a speciation event. So we think that this is the primary mode of speciation, particularly in animals. The populations get physically isolated for a time, diverge genetically to the point where they don't really see each other as the same thing. Now, we can also see this in situations where the ranges may overlap at times. For example, there's a species of finch which is found in the southern United States. And when they go to their breeding grounds in South America, they actually, again, if you were to look at this population in the United States, they actually look almost identical. And a local ornithologist was able to pick out a few morphological differences in them. And when he banded the birds to find out where they went for their breeding grounds, he found that they actually went to different regions of South America, so that they don't actually interbreed in South America, even though the ranges overlap in their feeding grounds in North America. So again, this would be another variation of an allopatric speciation event. They're not in the same place when they're breeding, so they don't breed with one another. And so we would consider them actually separate species, even though morphologically you and I look at them and say you look like the same thing. They actually don't interbreed with one another anymore, so they're different species. Now, sympatric speciation, what the word is trying to tell us is that this is a speciation event that occurs in the same country, so to speak, so an overlapping geographic range. So an example of this has been observed involving sunflowers, and we think this is much more common in plants than animals, although I'll give you an example of animals as well. So again, there are three varieties or species of sunflower which are found in the Utah desert, and we're just basically going to refer to them as type A, B, and C. And so it was thought that type C was a hybrid of types A and B because it shares kind of a combination of morphological features of type A and B. So again, if we look at this population, we theorize that we see these three species, and even though they don't normally interbreed with one another, we feel that there had to have been a speciation event in the past where they did produce a hybrid. So again, it was theorized then that type A and B would generate a type C, or at least had in the past at one time, to produce three distinct species as opposed to two. And so anyway, some researchers at the University of Utah decided to test this, and so they grew fields of type A mixed with type B. And lo and behold, they did get a few specimens of type C being generated. And what's interesting about that is that this type C would not breed back to type A or B, did interbreed with themselves, and actually interbred with the type C wild populations. And when you looked at the genetic signatures, they were virtually identical to the wild type C. So what's interesting about this is actually a duplication of a speciation event that we see in nature. So plants do this pretty readily because one of the things about plants is they often asexually reproduce. So when you do get hybrids that don't breed back to parents, they can asexually reproduce to produce more individuals. Now, and again, so their fields then basically looked like what we saw in the natural populations. Now, we think this is much rarer in animals, but again, there are situations where we do see this in animal populations. For example, we talked a little bit about cichlid fishes before, but one of the things that cichlid fishes have evolved in lakes to inhabit different depths of the lake. And so again, I was just reading actually a paper this week where we're looking at a speciation event occurring in a particular lake, in that some of the surface females that are living in clear waters will preferentially mate with blue pigmented males. And the females in the deeper water, more turbid water, can't see the blue pigment as well, and so they preferentially mate with red males. And so especially at the extremes, close to the surface and close to the greater depths, the females actually reject the opposite color. So here the females actually reject red males. Down here they actually reject blue males. And so again, they've also already developed genetic signatures. And in other lakes, we actually see distinct species based on the different stratifications in the lake. So again, this is an example, even though they're in the same place, they have separated themselves out and are actually a speciation event occurring within the same geographic area. And then the last type of speciation event that we observe, and again mostly in plants, although a few situations in animals, is what's known as a parapatric speciation. The prefix para means next to, so this would be a country next to another country, if you will. And so one of the places where this has been observed in what's known as tailing fields. Now, tailing fields are produced in mining operations. So in open pit mining, what happens, again, depending on what type of mineral we're interested in, but typically this would be something like silver or lead, other types as well. You know, you dig up the ore, you process the ore, you crush it, extract the metal of interest to you, and then you have to do something with this crushed and processed rock, and so it will be dumped places, and these are known as tailing fields. And the tailing fields will still have toxic levels of the mineral or the metal. So this was observed, has been observed in lead fields, silver fields, copper fields, and so on, these tailing fields. So what happens here is that we've seen examples where there are plants living in the ecosystem. You have a very abrupt distinction in the ecosystem. Now you have these tailing fields which are essentially toxic to the plants. And what will happen is that some plants develop a genetic mutation that allow them to tolerate this high level of toxic mineral, like, again, lead would be the example here. And grasses, you know, there will be a prevailing wind, for example, that allows pollination. So this is not a speciation event per se. Even though we have plants invading another region, that's not the speciation event because you still have pollen blowing downwind, and so you do still have an exchange of genes. But what has happened in some of these situations is that these new plants then also have changed the time of flowering. So they're flowering at different times from the original population. So this secondary mutation then does trigger a speciation event because even though pollen may be blowing downwind, these plants are not flowering at that time, and so they are not being inseminated or fertilized with those sperm, the sperm that are found in that pollen. So it's not just moving into the area that makes a speciation event. It's the change in flowering time then that actually makes it a speciation event because at that point then you do have genetic isolation. So again, these are just a few examples, and again, observable examples of where we are observing speciation events occurring. And again, some of them occur due to physical isolation, some in adjacent isolations, and also it can even occur in overlapping geographic ranges. So we'll talk more about evolution in our next module. Till the next time.